Okay, we're ready to go. This is one of my teaching videos. The topic for today is philosophical disability. Yeah, where's that come from? Comes from a lot of things. Comes from my own aging process. Comes from my interest in philosophy and my disinterest in philosophy, and back to an interest in philosophy, and even to recent times. Right now, I'm really considering and looking at the understanding and or even applying in a practical way ongoing is the notion of philosophical therapy, etc. So that's just an intro. I'll give you a trigger warning this morning in this video. That was a bit of a joke. That trigger warning for we're going to be covering existential territory, and I'm going to start with a few demonstrations of some of that territory and what we could call perhaps the terrible moment. A common metaphor used today by many teachers of all traditions, I've seen it almost everywhere, in popular culture anyway, particularly, is the glass half empty? Oh my, it's going down. There's only so much left. Or could we say, oh, the glass is half full? It's not the emptiness that we are looking at, it's the wholeness, the existent, positive, negative, positive. Which way do you want to look at life? Do you want to look at life as, or do you want to look at life, your life, as still full? And that fullness continues, full, 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 as long as the water exists. Some people call that the argument around positive attitude or negative attitude. What are you focusing your attention on? The half empty or the half full? And I think there's a larger issue there of the reality that at some point, drinking the water, which we do drink, which is part of life, the glass will go empty, and there'll be that terrible moment where you actually can't get up, or you aren't even breathing and movable to refill the glass. Let's enter another demonstration. Time. Sacred time. Sacred time is the time that is no time, the time before time. It's the time after time. Philosophical time, abstract time, quantum time, parallel universes. We could get all excited about all those possible realities of new constructs, new imaginaries for time. Reality of that time that I just demonstrated is, it is from the moment you're conceived, started, and from the moment after moment, whether we have time or not, in just biological processes of entropy, dissipation, decay of all forms, eventually, beep, 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 will occur. That is the moment of terrible time when you do not have the strength, or you're not even breathing, to reset the timer and start over again. I've been reading this novel by Irving Yalom. Very colorful book cover. He's written several novels. Irving Yalom is a existential psychotherapist, psychiatrist background, existential, real father of existential therapy in many ways in the contemporary world. He's very philosophical and he's very psychological, and he's a clinical practitioner for probably 40 years plus, and is coming to near the end of his life. He's well in his 80s, and he writes a lot and is a great teacher, mentor for many psychotherapists. And that's an American, he is, but won't say more about him. You can look him up if you want. But this book I was particularly interested in because of the title, The Schopenhauer Cure. It's his play in this novel form with him coming to understand the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, who he studied, and Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche with that. But Schopenhauer was a predecessor to Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche influenced greatly by Schopenhauer, as was Freud and Jung and so on. So Schopenhauer is part of my studies right now at this late stage of my own philosophical life, and coming to understand how that potential of a philosopher could have an impact on a kind of philosophical therapy. Well, that is very much a big theme of this book, and I just started it. I will read the opening as my another one of my demonstrations for this morning. Somehow I'll pull all these demonstrations together in a great synthesis of intelligent, brilliant synopsis. Yeah. Irving Yalom starts on the first page of a novel with this very interesting quote. So I'm going to read up here in this section. Every breath we draw wards off the death that constantly impinges on us. Ultimately, death must triumph. For by birth it has already become our lot, and it plays with its prey only for a short while before swallowing it up. However, we continue our life with great interest and much solicitude as long as possible, just as we blow out a soap bubble as long and as large as possible, although with the perfect certainty that it will burst. Very poetic, Mr. Yalom, Dr. Yalom, an impressive piece of poetics and philosophical poetics, really, to start. So I'm dealing with this notion this morning, just a reminder of philosophical disability. What is that? And then I'm going to make a distinction with philosophical handicap, and what is that? All within a sacred context. I'm not here to create cynicism, pessimism, nihilism, solipsism, and self-centeredness, and I'm not interested in all of those notions of being smart for the sake of being smart, being philosophical for the sake of impressing other philosophers, or whatever. As I've said before, I'm really fundamentally an educator, and yes, a philosophical educator in some way deeply, and a therapeutic educator. And one of the things I really like about Yalom's work is he really tries to look at that educational process and the therapeutic process in a very intimate, existential way. So always a little on that dark tone of we take from the moment we take our first breath. And I think he starts with the Stoics philosophy, sort of ancient Greek Stoics philosophy. As soon as we are born, we begin to die, as he's citing the words of Epicurus, I believe. One more demonstration image. So when you contemplate that image, there's something that I ask about in a philosophical way is, are we seeing a disability in that image? Are we seeing a handicap? Come back to that in a moment. So just a little quick bio. My first career was in environmental ecological sciences, as I've shared perhaps before in some of my videos. My next career was then going into education. Taught as a school teacher for a few years, and wrote and worked with as a consultant, education consultant. Then I went into the field of, I guess the simple word is it's the field of special education, disability, and rehabilitation work. And I was very fascinated by the full field of disability and critical theory of disability. And not only at the practitioner level, which I did, I worked with handicapped people in my training program. I've worked with behavioral disabled and addicted and many different populations, both as a counselor, therapist, case manager, and ultimately an educator, and more importantly, as a musician. I think you have to be a bit of a magician to work in these kinds of worlds of human care, service, and the uh, field of disabilities with real challenges that are faced with people with disabilities. So disabilities in that field of, at least when I was studying it, the common language was that a disability is in some sense natural. In some sense, it comes to all of us in different ways. We have various kinds of disabilities, which basically means areas where we're, quote, disabled, and more or less. And that is actually, quote, not the big problem in the field of disabilities work. It's just learn what your disabilities are, and then learn what your abilities are, and bring those together in a synthesis of realistic management of your life. And you can still live a great life with, quote, a disability. Because a disability isn't the worst thing that can happen to a living organism. You can still exist. However, if you have a disability, and that is that you can't swim very well, natural for a cow, that there's the problem then of, when does that disability start to become a handicap for you? And it becomes a handicap for you if you're a cow and you like pastures that are dry and just a little bit of water to drink now and then, as a good ecological state for that organism, that system. But if you are being a cow in the Anthropocene with global warming problems and melting glaciers and the world flooding, which this picture is attempted to demonstrate, and ongoing flooding, then your disability to not be a great swimmer is now going to become a handicap, and it's not your fault. In fact, the reality is that becoming handicapped is what the conditions of the environment, and in this case, in my interest, is in the cultural environment, the political environment, the historical environment, the oppressive environment that puts constraints on, and in some sense exacerbates and delimits one's disability into ability processes in growth and development. So that's the handicapping condition. It's from, to use simple language, the society itself. So we can take in an oppressive society and internalize that and oppress ourselves. The society can oppress people who with disabilities, cows with their disabilities that again are natural. So now to move to my concept of philosophical disability. All those opening demonstrations, the glass of water, the timer running out, and the terrible moment when one can't reset the button to continue on, at least in the form you're in, and, quote, you're basically dying or dead. And that whole tone of existential awareness of this reality of life, every breath we draw wards off the death. That's one perspective of an existentialist. That's Yalom. That's probably Schopenhauer's view as well. But it's not the only view, and it's not the only part of the existentialist, be it Schopenhauer, be it Yalom, Nietzsche, whatever. It's not the only part of their thought. And so that's something I'm interested in, is bringing an aliveness, a new aliveness to philosophical work from these great folks that have to offer gifts, and they also have, quote, their disabilities, and they also have handicaps because of the time and the history and the oppression that they experienced. So you have to kind of tweeze that out when you're reading these folks. And so philosophical disability is a term I thought would be a really interesting one to explore. So that's the focus of this video. I'll see what I say about it. I'll see if any of those images and ideas, I'm not necessarily going to bring all those together. You as a viewer can watch this video more than once. You could bring some of those metaphors that I've brought forth, those images I brought forth, the terms, and you could do your own creating, your own educating, your own learning, and perhaps even transforming those metaphors, those ideas into your own philosophical mood, your own philosophical temperament for the times. And I really set the time that we're in using this image. So in a sense, there's a philosophical disability right here in this image, where the mind, the philosophical set of the cow, could represent a human, is of such an extent, the environmental conditions, this Anthropocene, this time of mass extinctions, the time of imminent collapse of social and ecological systems, of potential extinction of our species and many others. The unlivability of the planet, at least for our type of living organisms, humans. That context is set there in that image, which I really like, and I want to hold it for this discussion of the philosophical disability, because I believe that it's a natural thing to have a philosophical disability to face life as a living creature. Now, that's problematic in many ways, because I have to look at my cultural conditioning, I have to look at my own woundedness and trauma, and maybe that's, creating a certain kind of deficit and fear-based mentality, or mood, or temperament, or mistrust, or even a kind of misogyny and or anthropology, not anthropology, a kind of anthropomorphic or even a misanthropic attitude, which is toward all humanity as a kind of disgust, a kind of betrayal and a bitterness to the kind of life and my fellow species who I am often incredibly disappointed with. Okay, I can include myself sometimes in that too. Not that I'm not trying to be human. I realize that I still see so much disability that I don't think is being acknowledged. So that's the point. Philosophical disability might be a very interesting concept to begin to, start from the kind of acknowledgement of, oh, I'm an alcoholic and I need to go to recovery rehabilitation. Or I'm a cow and there's way too much water and I can't swim anymore, and what am I going to do to handle that existential problem, that terrible moment of realizing, oh, I'm really not equipped. And this is my point here. Philosophical disability is a notion that acknowledges I'm not philosophically, one could say spiritually if you want, I'm going to stay with philosophically. One is not philosophically equipped for the philosophical demands of the time, of this end time, in a sense, that we're potentially experiencing. And we're trying to figure out how to work with this end times and adapt and cope and or ignore it and pretend everything is fine and let's go have a party. I like this notion from Patty Lather's work of working the ruins. Is this really nice phrase. It's not her own. It actually comes from a philosophical tradition out of Europe, which was kind of a working the post-Holocaust into the postmodern world of the modern promise collapsing and the Enlightenment philosophical tradition before modernism as part of modernism, and this great victory of human species and the mind and rational reason that actually has created incredible ruins. And that acknowledgement is the terrible moment. And I think that's a good definition also of what postmodern philosophy is a recognition of the terrible moment and a recognition, and this is what's not said in postmodernism that I know of, is it's the moment of recognition. Just like with the water, we can't fill the glass, the timer that runs out. There's some kind of point of a kind of near-death experience on a collective and individual level, psychic level, energetic level, historical level of a kind of end that can no longer continue. And in this case, yes, of course, there's a rebirth, and on the larger scale, once we get beyond, the body of the organism decaying and will not return in any kind of way that we know biologically or evolutionarily, again, without getting spiritual. So it's a philosophical moment of recognition of the whole thing is we're actually not prepared. I think this is the way Schopenhauer, even Yalom says it in his novel. There's a great line, I can't find it right in the moment, but we seem to be given the, quote, the gift of life, which has a great burden that goes with it, which is the awareness of our own death. And there's the shock, right? Beep, 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 beep. When we're shocked, awake, that, oh, and now we have to deal with our awareness of death itself. That's part of the human fate. And so the great gift of life is also brought the, if you will, gift of death, the ultimate dissolution. And that, of course, creates a great, huge philosophical questioning in all of philosophy, the east, west, south, north, through across time. I don't think there's anyone who would call themselves a philosopher, theologians included, and probably just most people who think about things reflectively, which is not everybody, that life is here as a challenge and as a sense where we feel that disability to actually be able to philosophically integrate, come to terms with death, the ultimate finality and finiteness of our existence. That's why existential means existence, coming to terms with our existence, developing some kind of philosophical attitude toward that, whether you're a philosopher or not. Just as a human being, we think philosophically. So let's get that straight. As we play with this notion of a philosophical disability, and then how we can work with that and develop that and develop ourselves in preparation for, those moments when the beeper is coming and it's an end time for us and or many that we love, and the great suffering and the pain of loss, which is real. So that's all part of the existential work. I don't think that's a heavy burden per se on its own. It actually can be part of a wonderful palette of creative potential and has invigorated many people and many thinkers and many individuals, and does to this day, to put that into a creative transformative framework. However, you can hear I'm not philosophically going to all kinds of transcendent modes and spiritual liftings and immortal life and so on. Those are concepts that are part of the existential understanding and philosophical vocabulary, and they have to be looked at because they're interesting. But ultimately, my point is I would rather stick with a real philosophical work, working the ruins of our contemporary time, and of, especially, this is harder for young people to relate to, I understand that, but I'm suggesting young people, you need to learn to relate to this earlier the better, is your own philosophical incapability of handling that final dismissal of your being on this planet as you've known it, life on this planet. So simply, if philosophical disability ought to be included in death studies and death thanatology, for example, the study of death and dying. And I don't think it has very well, and I'm going to suggest that that's a new platform for us to, and for me to bring forward. So I look forward to more discussions with you about that, and more discussions about how to teach ourselves and teach others this kind of philosophical orientation, which I like, is very pragmatic in the sense that because it's about life and death, it's about living and dying. And Arthur Schopenhauer, 19th century German philosopher, was thought to be, and several people have written on this, scholars and others, and I'm starting to see it as I'm just reading his work slowly, as he really is just going right in there as a philosopher to these really powerful questions and points of the terrible moment, of this first shock of waking up, that we become aware of our own mortality and those we love around us, they will all be lost. And it's inevitable. There's no winning over death in that sense. And then there's the second shock, which I like. Zach Stein, a philosopher I've been writing and thinking about lately, American younger philosopher, contemporary. He's talked about the second shock as well. The second, sort of a stunning that goes on, a stunning of, that wake up call, that beep, 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 that realization that the second shock is that we now, as a species, humanity, have brought about our own, quote, near imminent demise. And I've talked about that in some of my other videos, the great collapse, and I'm working on a notion of the great citizen, that great citizen, again, those are both videos you can look up on my YouTube channel, that would be part of the building and the container, really, the anxiety container, the fear container, the transformative container for this new way of coming to our philosophical disability and actually owning it, being responsible for it, and philosophically working with it. So I think there's a whole new excitement here for the whole field of philosophy around this notion of physical and beyond physical death, to a kind of philosophical dealing with death that is not just in the traditional modes and not just existentialism. I'm looking at an expanded imaginary beyond that, but including and integrating the best of that teaching from the existentialists. And Schopenhauer has been even compared to, and I think it's accurate, to Buddha, in this sort of interesting claim of the two most pessimistic so-called philosophers of the time that we know of in the published are Buddha and Arthur Schopenhauer, and I like that. I think it's a pretty accurate. However, what's not so accurate is the oversimplification and iconification and stereotyping of this notion that Arthur Schopenhauer and the Buddha were pessimistic only, because that's certainly a biased, and that's only seeing the glass half empty, perhaps, and not seeing glass half full of what their philosophies, spiritualities even, have to offer. And I don't have a problem seeing either of those philosophers I just mentioned as having a spiritual basis. And Arthur Schopenhauer, interestingly enough, was the first Western philosopher systematically studied Eastern philosophies from Hinduism, Buddhism, especially. Very interesting combinations. And so let's look forward to more continued discussion on this. And feel free to share your comments on the YouTube channel below. And let's continue this notion of philosophical disability, and therefore how we can bring ability, philosophical ability, to that disability, and at the same time undermine the handicapping conditions of a society, an oppressive society generally, in my view, a fear-based society that wants us to hide away and put our head in the sand and find all kinds of distractions and addictions and ways to avoid the ultimate beep, 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 beep. Thanks for listening today.